a priest and a rabbi walk into a bar. That was the main idea. All right, good evening, everybody. Friends from Beth Shalom, St. Paul's, friends from elsewhere. I saw we had a lot of people sign up, actually, who didn't belong to either congregation, who heard about it. We're glad to have you join us. Tonight is the first session of Deep Dive with Rabbi Ariel and Father Javier. This all started, there's a lot of different ways we could talk about how it started. My favorite way of talking about it is simply a priest and a rabbi walk into a bar. That was the main idea. It was a joke that Ariel and I were having, and I have my beer here too. And we decided, why don't we do this with, invite some folks along to take part in the conversation, even if it's over Zoom. So we're sitting at our own offices, home bars, you might say. And we hope that you'll pick your beverage of choice, of course, alcoholic, non-alcoholic, hot or cold, and you'll enjoy our conversation and hopefully take part in it too once we get to the Q&A. So Ariel, do you want to say a few words maybe about how we met, just how we got here?
Yes, so it's... I was thinking there's a very good rabbinic saying that I like that says, mitzvah goreret mitzvah, which means some good thing brings along another good thing. And one day, our mutual friend, Pastor Wolfgang, from Cary, called me out of the blue. I didn't even know him, and said, hey, we had a mutual friend, and there's this meeting, and would you like to come? It's about making a difference in the community and this, and he explained to me, and of course I attended that meeting, and in that meeting it was a small group of clergy, and of course you were there. This is what eventually led 2 years later to the One Wake organization and all that. And I not only usually appreciate all this group of people, everyone is it's a wonderful presence, but I like hearing you and talking with you. So I remember that very quickly. And so quite frankly, this is a pleasure for me that we have that opportunity to chat now.
Yeah, me too, actually. And, I was thinking about it as we were getting ready for tonight. But, I feel as though we already did this before, because I remember one of the first things we got to do together that you invited me to meet some of your folks was a gathering at one of your folks' homes where, we had a small group, 15, 20 people, and we just talked for a couple of hours about what we were trying to do together as we were establishing One Wake. But it also happened to be the day of the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, and it was just this weird timing where we were able to come together and have what I thought was just one of the conversations I very much treasure, because it seemed so important for us to be together that night. And I was just really grateful for the invitation and for the welcome I received at that time. So I just think of these conversations as continuing the tradition of that conversation.
Yes.
Well, let me say a couple of housekeeping things before we get going to our topic. What we're thinking of doing is talking for about 40 to 45 minutes. We've been thinking about a theme together. We talked about it a little bit, and we just wanted to have conversations around vocation. What does that mean to us? What does it mean to be called? What might that mean for a rabbi and a priest? I mean, we picked like a real easy topic that might be interesting to a rabbi and a priest, talk about vocation. But I think it should be interesting because I frankly haven't had this conversation with a rabbi before. And so I'm looking forward to it. And so the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll leave some room for Q&A. And so as you can see in the Zoom webinar options on the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see, you can raise your hand, you can type in a question to the Q&A that we can read. In the Q&A, if you raise your hand, we can call on you at that point and have you unmute yourself and you can say your question out loud. We would just ask that if you can at all, maybe hold your questions till we wrap up our conversation. We wanted to go back and forth a little bit and then be able to take questions sort of like we would if we were doing a forum. I realize webinar, doing this thing online is new to many of us. So I think it's a fun way to engage, but we're also very much in the learning curve. So we'd appreciate your patience and for you to be along with us for the ride. Anything else I missed, Ariel? Do you think that covers it?
No, just only when you're invited, I understand, to write your questions there on the Q&A, but when we do the Q&A, you'll be talking.
Yeah, and that'd be great. So if you want to ask your question, raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. Well, to start us off, our theme for tonight, vocation. What does it mean to be called? And I have this question in the back of my mind. I know we talked about it, but Krista Tippett on Being, always asks this in her podcast, asks, what was your spiritual life like in your childhood? And I don't want to ask that question. I'm just curious, did you know that you wanted to be a rabbi when you were a kid? Was there some inkling of that in your childhood? And if not, what did you want to be? What was that like for you?
Yeah, well, so if you were my therapist, I would talk to you for hours about my upbringing and family. So I was born into a rabbi's family. My father was a rabbi in the Orthodox and eventually became conservative tradition. So very traditional in many ways. My father had 3 other brothers, my uncles, all of them were rabbis and in different places. And by the time I was a little boy, I don't know why that happens, but you ask all the children of clergy, they have a special life. Everybody would turn to me at one point and say, oh, so you're going to be a rabbi, right? And you're going to be like your dad. And so the thought that that was a possibility was always there. And I definitely felt everywhere. That would be the second question people ask me. So are you going to be a rabbi? Right? And I must say that might have been one of the reasons why when somebody asked me at age 13, right after my bar mitzvah, so you think you're going to be a rabbi one day? And I said, I don't know what I'm going to be. I know one thing I'm not going to be. It's a rabbi.
Yeah, that makes sense. That feels like a lot of, I think I react that way too. A lot of expectation makes me run the opposite way.
Well, and it's interesting because, and we'll talk more obviously, but we're talking about calling. And by calling, it's I've been thinking all this week since we thought about this, because calling is not a word that I usually hear at least in Jewish circles. I do not hear lots of rabbis that talk about their calling or when they were called. That's not a word that they use. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, what am I going to say about it? Do I have a call? Who called me? And the more I thought about it, I realized, oh yes, of course, I know exactly what we're talking about. And but the initial call it's not okay. It doesn't work if it's somebody else's call. If it's your parents calling and saying, do this, or your community. the call eventually has to come from within, right? It has to be a personal thing. So that's why those calls I had to reject, right? I had to find my own.
That makes sense. And you know, the calling language has always been complicated for me too. I have never been. I think I've made decisions in my life that have landed me in situations, but I have never been able to identify a single moment when I decided to do that, you know? And so calling for me brings up these images of like, you know, Moses in the burning bush, you know, just these like clear sort of like moments where people know exactly what they want to do. And, you know, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an architect, you know, like I like to draw, I like to paint, like that's what my parents thought might be a good fit. You know, don't be a starving artist, be an architect. That's like a job. And so that's where my energy went. But maybe similarly to you, I was surrounded by, grew up in a different Christian tradition, more conservative, evangelical, we might call it tradition. And I was surrounded by lay preachers, and my father was a lay preacher, so he didn't work as a pastor. He had another day job, but he was a preacher within our church. He led, you know, Bible study. He did all this work within the church that was very much present in my life. And I was surrounded by a lot of people who looked at me and thought, well, you know, you should be a pastor. And I just didn't see it, you know. And at some point, I think, you know, late in high school, I narrowed down. In college, I thought I'm gonna go into social services, you know, be a social worker. Um, and my main reason for that, I think this was me kind of coming out of that religious tradition that was much more black and white about most ethical questions, very sort of determined set of ways. I that didn't resonate with me, and I thought I don't want to be the guy standing up front telling people what to believe and what the right thing is. I think I'd be a lot better at listening to them instead. And so I thought I'll do social work. You know, like being a social worker seems like a much more natural fit for me. And so, you know, being a pastor wasn't something I thought about as a kid, as a sort of like, that's what I want to do.
So, you know, one thing, I have a question for you, but before that, it resonated with me. I knew lots of rabbis growing up, and I hope this doesn't sound bad what I'm going to say, but it's a little critical. So I knew plenty of rabbis, and of course, my uncles, my dad's colleague on the same congregation. I know their children, their families. My dad had students who became rabbis. So, and you know, the prophet in his own, which means that when you see the rabbi not on the pulpit and teaching and all that, but when you see the rabbi in the kitchen in his pajamas a Sunday morning arguing with his wife and you know, talking about other people, you see another side, and you see in some ways their human failings, right? And you see how the amazing things and what they say and all that. Well, some do better in life and some don't do all that well embodying those things, right? And so to me, that was the connotation I got. And I also was surrounded by these rabbis who were from a very prescriptive tradition. You need to do this, don't do that. You eat this, you don't do that. On Shabbat, you don't drive, you don't do this. And then I look at many of them and I said, but you're not particularly a great person, you know? You're not the best father, you know? You're not maybe the best husband. So I'm not sure that I want to be not only that person telling other people what to do, but I'm not sure that I want to set in myself as a rabbi, as a model, as a standard, when we don't measure up to that.
Yeah, that yeah, that hits home. Yeah, I don't. and I could say from all those people that I now look back on, I don't think of them as being bad people, because I could tell the hypocrisy of the standards that they set for themselves and for others, and how they failed at it. I was telling a friend, I just think they were normal people, that like it doesn't even mean that they were bad. It's just that I look at them and I'm like, oh yeah, you are just average. It's pretty normal to kind of screw up and not be able to do the things that you say that you're going to do. But I think that standard, that way of talking very prescriptively, made me run the opposite direction. And
So what made you not run in the opposite direction and one day, I know, join divinity school?
yeah, that's a good question. I think I've told some of my folks at St. Paul's this story, but I was working in social services for the first time right out of college. I was very young, very inexperienced. I was learning a lot, and it was a steep learning curve, and I was frankly just a little overwhelmed. And I had not participated in a church community in a while. I had been a pretty religious person growing up, but I had gotten to this point where I didn't know how to make sense of being a religious person. So I just hadn't been going to church. And I remember sitting in a coffee shop in Seattle, because that's what you do when you're in Seattle. You just go from coffee shop to coffee shop. It's raining outside. You need something warm. You sit there, you read, and then you move on to the next one. And I was sitting there and I was thinking, you know what, like, I've got plenty of counselors and social workers in my circles, in my professional circles, that do just fine without being religious. But I think I need a place for me to figure out some of these questions and get the spiritual resources that I need to be able to do this work. Because I was just feeling maxed out, just emotionally, spiritually drained. And I looked up and I just remember seeing a woman walk out of a restaurant with a clergy collar on, which I didn't grow up with people with clergy collars, which is something we use in the Episcopal tradition. Some other, Christian traditions use that too. But so I hadn't grown up with people with collars or women that could wear collars and practice, the pastorship. I grew up in a church where it was mostly men that were the leading role. And I remember that moment that someone had told me, you should check out the Episcopal Church, that a couple friends had suggested it. And I walked out of the coffee shop and found St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Seattle, which was the first Episcopal church I joined and started attending. And I think it was there that Melissa, that priest, she's a wonderful, wonderful priest, just modeled for me a different way of being a pastoral guide. Was very generous, and also at the same time helped me own some of the statements of faith that I had kind of fallen back from. So at the same time that she was generous, she said some things with conviction about why it mattered for me to have a relationship with a church community, have a relationship with God, what that might mean in my life and my work. And it was in talking to her that I told her, I think I'm going to go to divinity school, but I'm going to do it on the side. So I was looking at combined programs between divinity and social work and public policy. I knew that I wanted to keep thinking about how systems worked. I'm very grateful that those things have come together in my job as a priest. But, I was just always thinking, like, I want to think sort of macro level. And I thought, I just need this philosophy itch, this like theology, like I need to figure out why I'm doing all these things. And I told Melissa, I'm going to go to divinity school, but I'm only doing it on the side. And she asked me, I remember, do you want to be a priest? Do you think that there might be a call? And she didn't tell me that she thought there might be a call. She just asked me, and I said, not a chance. I'm just gonna go do this thing because I can, and I'm not gonna think about it. And I ended up in divinity school, ended up working in a bunch of different settings, churches, and eventually something clicked for me that I don't even know how to describe. It wasn't a decision moment, but I think I had figured out through that process of learning and working in churches and getting to know people in churches and doing the work that I was doing before as a social worker in a different angle, that the image that I've had as I was discerning my call to the priesthood is the phrase we use, was that I was getting closer and closer to being behind the altar table, which is where we bless the elements, bless the bread and the wine for the Eucharist, which is the central sort of worship of at least within the Episcopal Church. That's the place. And I just felt like I started out in the back pew being one of those people like, I really want to be here, but I've got work outside of here. And I kept finding myself in positions that got me a little bit closer to the front and a little bit closer to standing behind it. And it was gradual for me. I don't know, and it wasn't until, I finished divinity school, started working at a church. I still wasn't sure if I wanted to work at a church because I just happened to find a job where I didn't have to be ordained. And even then, even till the moment I was ordained, honestly, and St. Paul's in Cary hired me, I was like, let's see how this goes. I'm not sure if this is gonna be for me, but let's see how this goes.
It goes well for you and for them.
Thank you. Yeah, I like it. I don't know.
It's fascinating because so many things, some things about your life up to here and your journey I knew before this conversation, some things I didn't. And what I'm learning now, it's in so many ways so close to my own experience, because I, after growing in this religious family community, I was fully immersed, Jewish day school every day, services, that was my life. And in my early 20s as an adult, I had to find my own way and wander far and away and explore everything else. Even exploring, I remember going to Hare Krishna temples and Buddhism, just exploring other ways of understanding and even the spiritual world, not just Jewish, right?
Yeah.
And eventually, because of these accidents of life, I ended up in Mexico City needing a job. And a rabbi who was a former student of my dad knew me since I was a little kid and said, hey, I have a job for you. Come teach in a religious school and bar mitzvah kids. And I said, hey, I need a job. I can do that. Sure. But there were people who were interested in learning about Judaism. And at some point, they were interested maybe even in converting to Judaism. So they wanted really somebody to tell them, so what is Judaism? Teach me, right? Teach me about Judaism. And what happened is that I stopped at that moment and said, wait a minute, I shouldn't say things that I don't believe. So if I'm going to teach about Judaism, it has to be what I can embrace and what I can fully stand behind. And that started in me a process of thinking, so what do you fully believe? What do you stand behind? All these things you learn, which one you embrace, which one you shouldn't? And it was a process of doing that. And I also had a rabbi who, just like you, had the priest or that somehow pushed you forward to the altar. I had a rabbi that literally push me forward to the altar. He will call me and say, you know, this Shabbat, I'm a little tired, don't feel very well. How about you give the sermon? And things like that. So one day I realized, after several years, I look at my week and I realized that I've been teaching children, adults, introduction to Judaism, preaching, reading from the Torah, and I'm saying, if I'm living like a rabbi and working as a rabbi, I might as well be a rabbi. And decided to fully embrace it, but finding a way of doing it that worked for me. So in some ways, you know, my dad was, I'm a rabbi, disappointed, of course, because I'm very different from what he was. Yeah. But it works for me. And I think it took me a long detour to realize, okay, this is how I can embrace my Jewishness. And I think it's been great ever since for me.
It's great. Yeah, and I'm seeing just the similarities between how we went about that process. It feels like it was the image that coming to mind is that I came into that altar sideways. You know, some people walk straight up, you know, from the entrance to the altar, and I just kind of wandered around the building and found a side door and eventually made it over there. You know. Yeah, so I'm curious, you know, setting aside sort of the language of calling and maybe zooming out a little bit beyond being a rabbi and a priest, what does calling, what does vocation mean to you? You know, what does that look like? Beyond sort of rabbi and priest, but, you know, how do you make sense of that? You know, now that we're talking about these words that maybe are very fitting for priests and rabbis, but maybe not all that useful for people who maybe don't think about their careers that way.
Yeah. So I was thinking of, I see two different kinds of callings, right? So one is what I think is important for everybody in life. Find your calling, right? Which means find your passion, find what you really care about. Because one thing I am sure of is life is better if you can spend your time doing something you believe in and something you like and something you value and something you appreciate. And this might be a little bit of a privileged situation. You know, many people have to do in life what they need to do in life to support themselves, support their families. They don't have the luxury of choosing their passion, right?
Yeah.
Knowing that, I think that putting your passion on something, that's a kind of calling, right? And I have nephews who are musicians, and they struggle pretty much very hard, particularly now. Imagine all musicians that play live music and they don't have where to do it. So, but for them it's a calling. That's where their passion is. That's what they know they have skills for. And when you have a passion that you identify and the skills that match it or abilities that match it, there you go. That's the perfect calling. Go for it. And in some ways, being a rabbi at some point became that for me. Yeah, I have this passion for the learning and for the teaching and for the reading and for the singing and for some of the traditions. And that's my calling. But I then always had somewhere deep in my mind, and this might be back from my upbringing, that calling is not just do what you want, do what makes you happy, do what you, are good at. Calling somehow means being challenged to do what you can, do what's right, do what's true. Try to do something that is better. Step out of your comfort zone and be up there. I was the last person that wanted to stand behind the pulpit and speak. My heart will palpitate and race, and this. I was so happy in the last row of any synagogue. And I think that's the calling. That's the calling, right? The challenge to say, you know what? Hey, you have something that maybe you can do. Go for it. Just do it. And it might be hard, and it might be challenging, or it might not be your comfort zone. Well, do something. Make a difference in this world, right? And so to me, being called, God calling, as opposed to a general calling, that's what I would say is the calling to just go and do what's right, do what you think it's true, even if it doesn't please your parents or your teachers or the authorities or your original community. Follow truth, whatever you find it, in divinity school or later or in somewhere else. And I think that's the calling that was the most important for me.
Is there an image that sort of I'm hearing the sort of overtones of challenge there, the work that it pushes you toward. Is there an image that comes to mind for you with that?
Well, thank you for that question, because yes, there is. And the image that comes to mind, and sometimes it's a good image, sometimes it's not a good image, is Moses, right? Because Moses is the quintessential biblical leader, is the one that, go to Pharaoh and take the people out, and the 10 Commandments and everything else. On the other hand, was Moses a happy man doing all of that?
Yeah.
He seemed to have started by being happy being a shepherd somewhere in some desert. And God calls, hey, we need somebody to go and free the people. You do it. And Moses says, me? Find somebody else. I'm not good. I cannot do this. I cannot speak. There's all kinds of limitations. And he's challenged to step up and become Moses. That was not his natural course. And so to me, that's the perfect image. And over his life, every time there's a challenge in the journey, 40 years in the desert, people complain, and Moses says, God, why did you put me here? Look at your people. So he's always struggling with the challenge and the burden of taking that role and following that calling. And yet he did, and I think pretty well, right? So the challenge is that, imagine what a waste had Moses stayed as just a shepherd. I mean, he could have been a great shepherd, great father, but we missed all the potential that was there. So that to me is the image that reflects what calling is. I'm sure you must have some biblical image there.
Well, now that you mention it, I specifically, I'm sitting in my office right now, and right here, this image right here, that's an icon of Moses receiving the law, from the Sinai region. So I felt like it was an appropriate spot for us to have this conversation, but the image that comes to mind for me is just one of my favorite passages of scripture, but it's Elijah. It's another one of these, iconic, there's Moses and then there's Elijah, and there's that moment where he's running for his life. The king wants to kill him, and he's afraid. He's just deadly afraid, and he gets a message from God. An angel shows up, tells him that he has to walk 40 days and 40 nights on the strength of some bread and some water, and that at the end of that journey, maybe he'll get another message from God. So he goes, and he ends up on the mountain, on the holy mountain, and he's waiting, and he's waiting, and he's waiting, and an earthquake comes by, and he knows God isn't there. God isn't in the earthquake. A great wall of fire comes by. No, God isn't in the great wall of fire. A great tempest, like a great wind rushes through it, and God isn't there either. And then there's this passage, where it says, like, a little still small voice, a sheer silence, a grainy silence. And he knows that God is there, and he is terrified. And I think what resonates to me about your image, about the challenge, is coming to a point where you figure out something that you're supposed to do. It's not gonna be without its challenge. It's sort of demand for a leap of faith of some kind. Like you don't know what's coming. And at that moment, Elijah covers his face, only sees God's as God is walking by. Doesn't actually see God, and then he gets a message to go back down, to get off the mountain and go back and do the work that he's been sent here to do. And that is incredibly scary to me. It's a challenging passage to like sort of figure out, okay, if I mean calling in that sense, that requires risk. That requires, pushing yourself. That requires something other than doing what you're naturally good at. And I still think about that. I think I've grown into some habits as a priest. I've grown into knowing how to speak in front of people. It was something that I didn't imagine myself doing when I kept telling people I'd rather listen to people instead of talking in front of people. But I've now grown into some of that. I'm not saying that it's perfect, not saying that it couldn't take some more work, but I know how to do some of that. And I keep thinking, I know the next call is going to push me in a different way. I don't think of calling as like a one-time deal, like you got it, you started doing it, and it's done. I keep sort of coming up across situations where I'm like, oh no, is that the next thing I'm supposed to do? Because that's scary. That would require risk of me that I didn't think I could do, and that is intimidating, a little bit, but I think also rewarding.
I have that, now that you say, when you said the next calling, and this is exactly how I feel. And I'm a little older than you. And so I can tell you that I think this is my 20th year as a rabbi, and getting close to that. And I had this image of callings that stack up, because it's not really that there's a calling and then you go do something else and that one disappears. It's you have the call to do this, and at one point hopefully you'll hit the cruise control. You know what you're doing, your routine, your week, your teaching, your preaching, your activity, and you get comfortable and settled, which is a great thing. And usually when that happens, that's when you might start hearing, at least in my experience, all right, so you got this, right?
Right.
Now what, right? What's going to be next? What's going to be next? And I think that that's the challenge, that the calling stack up. And I remember, my thoughts initially when I started being a rabbi. And I know now that I'm in my 50s already, and the callings are different. And I'm beginning to think also in terms not only of all those things that a rabbi does, which is you serve a community, you accompany people in their dramas, in their good and bad days, as I like to call it, in their joys and in their oys. And so, that's the call of a rabbi. But I'm beginning to think of, and what's the next one? And the next one, living something behind. Am I contributing something? Do I have an original interpretation, idea, a writing? I don't know, a practice.
Could you repeat that again? Because I think you cut out right when you said it. The next one.
So the next one of the calling in my mind now is beginning to think of a legacy. So, because we do all things that are serving needs for today, right? If somebody has a family emergency, somebody's dying, a burial, a counseling, those are things we do for today, and it's great, and it's one of the satisfactions, I think, of our call is that we get to do things that are meaningful, that, I may do well or not, may do better. Sometimes you can help people, sometimes you can't, but at least you're doing something that is really worth my time, right? It's really worthwhile. But they're all now. And I'm beginning to think, maybe because I'm part of this tradition who is thousands of years old and has lots of text and writing, all right, what am I going to leave behind? I'm going to leave something. And I hope that I can leave some prayers behind. We have our own prayer book in Beth Shalom and some thoughts or interpretations. I was thinking a lot since that first meeting that you and I had in what became One Wake of, as an American Jew, what am I doing? What am I leaving behind? And what I hope I'm trying to do is this notion that we cannot be isolated on a Sunday or Saturday in small little groups because we're different religions or ethnic groups. That it is our duty, my duty as an American Jew, as your Episcopalian American, we need to connect, we need to do things together without diluting in any way who we are, but we need to do that. And we all hear this, but don't often see it done. And so I'm beginning to think of the calling in that. And that's why even having this conversation for me, I said at the beginning that it's just a pleasure, yes, but I think it's meaningful and it's important, and in ways that hopefully are lasting beyond this conversation.
I love that you named that because I was talking to a friend just in the last couple of days, and I told her that we were doing this, and she said, "Oh, is this another one of your organizing things?" And I said, "No, not really, but it overlaps. I mean, that's how we met. It's what we're doing." And I think there's like this, like it doesn't cheapen it if it's if it's a confluence of all these things, if it's legacy and I'm enjoying this, like I wanted to have this conversation with you just because this sounds like fun to do. And I'm, one of the lingering questions I have, and I realize we're coming up against time, but I still want to ask it because I think it's going to lead us into our next topic for next week anyway, is one of the things I'm scared of when talking about calling as a challenge is that we often frame things that are worth doing by naming how much we have to suffer for them, and I do think being challenged is important, but I also think there are plenty of people who feel as though they have to suffer to find what they have, they are called to do. And I almost want to say, like, no, you don't, the only pathway there isn't by sacrificing yourself. There's something about calling that speaks of joy and enjoyment, and our topic next week will be exactly that. Like, how do we talk about joy, and what we do and how we go about our lives, and how we talk about joy, especially right now when, we're all home for the sake of the common good, but it's hard to enjoy, tuning into the news, trying to figure out what to do in this world that's so scared, And so I guess, is there a balance there? Like it's a challenge, but it's also something that like our conversation right now, that I'm like, I wanted to do this because I wanted to enjoy it, but it also felt like a really fitting thing to do, because we're both interested in doing good work together across our faith traditions. And I love how you said that, without diluting our particular identities, coming together without diluting that, you know. So anyway,
Yeah. So we come from traditions that the word sacrifice appears a lot, right? And there's almost this notion that suffering is terrible, but suffering itself provides some good, or suffering is a way to, achieve a higher stage and all that. And we seem not to have all that much emphasis on joy as a way of achieving that. So I'll leave the joy part for the next time. Because I think, we need to talk about that. But I would say, in terms of the sacrifice and the calling, one of the things, so when I first began being a rabbi, my first congregation was in Barcelona in Spain. And it was a small congregation. I was the only staff person. There was a lot to do. It was a very young congregation, recently created. And there was 24 hours of work to do every day if I wanted to give it 24 hours every day. And I made the, I don't know if conscious or not decision, but hey, young rabbi, my first congregation. And I would often come home after being all day at work, maybe at 10, 11 p.m. at night, sometimes even more. And what I realized is not that I was sacrificing or that I was, answering my call of being rabbi and serving the community. Well, yes, I was doing that very well, I think. But by doing that, I was failing the call of being at home. Had a wife and children, and I'm called to be a father, especially once I have children. So we're called to many other things. I'm also called not to be burned out, right? And I'm called to self-care. We are all called to self-care. So I think that sometimes, who takes care of the caregivers? That's a very typical thing. People who are focused and oriented on maybe serving others or trying to do something for others, sometimes it's not a naturally balanced way of living. And we have to remind ourselves, and people have to remind ourselves, you know what, it's great what you do. It's great what you do to others. It's great to sacrifice some things, but not everything. You need to give yourself and all these other callings, your family, your children. I was very intentional, for example, trying to, when I can hear, not to repeat those mistakes and make sure that I get to play soccer with my young boy, because now he's not young anymore and he doesn't want to play soccer with me. So that was a call. So the balance, I think it's important. And, we're not all called to be Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Moses. We don't all have to change the world by sacrificing ourselves and dying for others. For some of us, and I remember A Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart, our life is meaningful by maybe small things that we do for others that we sometimes are not even aware of. Right? And that's not a smaller calling.
Right. No, I think that's a good word to lead us into next week. Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation.